The wind in Pinon Bluff had a taste. It tasted of red dust so fine it settled on your tongue, of the sharp, medicinal tang of pine resin from the high hills, and of something metallic and cold, like gun grease. It was late autumn in the New Mexico territory, 1886, and the town was a raw scratch in the landscape, clinging to the edge of a plateau. Buildings of rough-sawn lumber and sun-baked adobe lined a single street, wide enough for a 16-mule freight wagon to turn, which it rarely did. Rhea Calder, 25 years old, held her brother's hand so tightly her own knuckles were white. Benji was 7, and he was shrinking. His skin had a pale, waxy sheen, and his breathing was shallow, punctuated by a dry cough that seemed to rattle his whole small frame. 2 days. 2 days since they had eaten anything but a handful of dried berries found rattling on a bush near the dry arroyo where they had slept. Rhea's focus narrowed to the glass window of Nolan Pritchard's bakery. The smell of yeast and baked flour, warm and thick, was a physical assault. It made her stomach cramp with a hollow, burning ache. Inside, loaves sat on a wooden rack, their crusts a deep, beautiful brown. She pulled the collar of her worn dress closer. It was a calculated risk, born of absolute necessity. The town was quiet. The mid-afternoon lull had drawn most folks inside, away from the persistent wind. "Stay here. Benji," she whispered, her voice rough. "Right by this post. Don't move. I will be right back." Benji looked up, his eyes wide with a fear that had become his normal expression. He nodded, clutching the wooden veranda post with both hands, as if it were an anchor. Rhea pushed the door open. A small bell tinkled, a cheerful sound that felt like a betrayal. The air inside was warm, a paradise of heat and scent. A young woman, not much older than Rhea, was wiping down the counter, her back to the door. On the counter, near the end, sat a basket of day-old rolls. Beside it, cooling on the rack just behind, were the fresh loaves. Rhea's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird in a small cage. She was not a thief. She was a sister. The distinction felt razor-thin, and then it vanished entirely. She drifted, light-headed, toward the rack. Her hand, chapped and scraped, moved with a life of its own. It closed around the warm, solid weight of a small loaf. It was heavy. It was life. She slipped it under the thin shawl that covered her shoulders. Her movements desperate but practiced from months of trying to appear invisible. She was turning, already tasting the relief. When the girl at the counter looked up, the girl's eyes widened, not in anger at first, but in surprise. Then they dropped to the unnatural bulk under Rhea's shawl. The girl's mouth opened, and she let out a shriek that cut through the warm air like a knife. "Thief, stop her, mister! Pritchard, she's stealing." Rhea bolted for the door, shoving it open, the bell clanging wildly. She grabbed Benji's hand. "Run! Benji, run!" But they didn't get 5 feet. A heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder, spinning her around. It was Deputy Jeb Crow. His waistcoat strained over a thick belly, his face flushed with irritation and stale whiskey. His badge was a dull piece of tin, but it carried the weight of law. "And just where do you think you're going, girlie?" His voice was a wet growl. The loaf of bread tumbled from under her shawl, landing in the red dust of the street with a soft, tragic puff. The street, empty moments before, began to fill. It was as if the shriek had been a signal. Doors opened. Men stepped out of the saloon, wiping foam from their mustaches. Women paused on the boardwalk, baskets on their hips. A crowd formed, circling, their faces a uniform mask of judgment. She took it right off the rack. The bakery girl pointed, her voice shrill with self-importance. Nolan Pritchard, the owner, burst out of the shop. He was a small, precise man with a ledger for a soul. He saw his loaf in the dirt, and his face purpled. "A thief. In my own shop, Crow. You arrest her?" Jeb Crow grinned, enjoying the audience. He grabbed Rhea's right arm and twisted it behind her back, forcing her to her knees. A sharp, bright pain shot from her wrist to her shoulder. She cried out, clamping her jaw shut against a second scream. The humiliation was worse than the pain. She was on her knees in the main street of Pinon Bluff, a common criminal, for a single loaf of bread. Benji, who had been frozen by the post, finally broke. He launched himself at the deputy, his small fists beating uselessly against the man's thick leg. "Let her go. Don't take my sister. She didn't mean it. We're hungry." Benji's cry was high and desperate, the sound of a small animal in a trap. It cut through the murmuring of the crowd. For a moment, a few faces softened. A woman at the front, holding her own daughter's hand, winced and looked away. A mule skinner near the saloon spat into the dust, a flicker of disgust in his eyes, but no one moved, no one spoke. To interfere with Jeb Crow was to interfere with Nolan Pritchard, and Pritchard held the notes on half the town. Crow laughed and, with one boot, casually shoved Benji away. The boy fell hard, his head hitting the boardwalk. He didn't cry out from the fall, just stayed on the ground, his sobs turning into ragged, hopeless gasps. "That's enough of that, boy," Crow snarled. "This is what happens when we let vagrants and drifters into this town," Pritchard announced to the crowd, his voice rising like a preacher's. "They breed thieves. They poison the well. She needs to be taught a lesson." He pointed a finger at Rhea. "I demand she be marked out for thief, so all decent folk know her, and 30 days of labor she can scrub my floors and feed my ovens for 30 days to pay for that loaf." A murmur of agreement went through some in the crowd. 30 days of labor. It was a death sentence for Benji. Rhea's blood ran cold. She couldn't speak, her throat locked with terror. And then, a figure separated from the shadows of the livery stable. He had been there the whole time, leaning against a support beam, watching. The crowd parted for him, not because he pushed, but because he seemed to draw the space around him. He was tall, leaner than the other men, and his duster was the color of the dust itself, faded and worn. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but it couldn't hide the stillness of his posture. He moved without hurry, each step deliberate, his spurs making no sound in the thick dust. This was Silas Hartwell. He stopped not in front of Crow, but in front of Nolan Pritchard, who was still enjoying his speech. Hartwell's silence was louder than the baker's shouting. Pritchard faltered. "Hartwell, this ain't your concern. This is a matter of town justice." Silas Hartwell did not look at Pritchard. His gaze was fixed on the loaf of bread in the dust. Then he looked at Benji, who was struggling to his feet, a dark bruise already forming on his pale temple. Finally, Hartwell looked at Nolan Pritchard. His eyes, from under the brim of his hat, were the color of gray stone. He reached into the pocket of his duster and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. Without a word, he stepped up onto the boardwalk and tossed it onto the bakery's outdoor counter, where a few pies were displayed under netting. The pouch landed with a solid, heavy thud. The sound of metal on wood was definitive. The string had come loose, and a cascade of coins spilled out. They weren't pennies. They were heavy Mexican silver pesos, dulled from circulation, mixed with the unmistakable bright shine of 3, maybe 4, American silver dollars. The crowd went utterly silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. That was more than a month's wages. It was a fortune for a single loaf of bread. Nolan Pritchard's eyes, which had been bright with righteousness, now bulged with naked greed. His hands twitched. Silas Hartwell spoke. His voice was low and even, with no more emotion than the wind passing over rock. It carried easily in the sudden quiet. "I'm paying for the loaf," he said. And the damage to his honor, he let that sit for a moment. Then he turned his head, just slightly, toward Jeb Crow, who still had Rhea's arm locked in a painful grip. His gaze rested on the deputy's hand on Rhea's arm. Then he looked at Rhea. She was still on her knees, her face streaked with dust and tears, her eyes wide and confused, staring at him as if he were a ghost. "You and the boy," Silas Hartwell said. His voice flat. "A command, not an invitation. You'll come with me." Jeb Crow's face was a map of conflicting emotions. He was angry at being challenged, his authority made small, But Silas Hartwell was not some drifter. He was the man who lived alone out in Silver Spur Hollow, the man who kept to himself, the man who, it was rumored, had faced down 3 railroad bulls by himself and hadn't even drawn his gun. Crow looked from Hartwell's still form to the pile of silver gleaming on the counter. With a grunt of frustration, he released Rhea, shoving her forward. "Get out of here." Then, "Vagrant trash." Rhea stumbled, catching herself before she fell. She scrambled to her feet, her arms screaming in protest. She ignored the pain, rushing to Benji, pulling him up and checking his head. He was dazed but conscious. She wrapped her arm around him, pulling him tight against her side. Nolan Pritchard, his moral outrage completely evaporated, was already at the counter, his fingers sifting through the coins, his lips moving as he counted. The crowd began to break apart. The show over, the tension gone. They dispersed, murmuring, glancing back at Hartwell with a new, wary respect. Rhea stood alone in the street with Benji. Silas Hartwell had not moved. He waited. She looked at him, her heart a confusion of fear and a fragile, unfamiliar gratitude. He was a stranger. He had bought her, as surely as Pritchard had tried to enslave her. But his eyes, when they had met hers, held no malice. They held nothing at all. They were just still. He gestured with his head toward a worn buckboard wagon tied up near the livery. Rhea Calder took a deep breath, the red dust filling her lungs. She held her brother's hand and took the first step, walking away from the town and toward the silent man who had just paid for her life with silver. Silas untied the buckboard and gestured for Rhea and Benji to climb up. Rhea hesitated, her eyes darting back toward the town, then to the man. He offered no help, just waited, his patience as solid and unmoving as the hills. She lifted Benji onto the wooden seat, the boy scrambling over, and then she climbed up, seating herself on the far edge, pulling her thin shawl tight. She kept Benji between them. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels crunching over the dusty street. Silas handled the team, 2 sturdy mules, with quiet, economical movements. They passed the last adobe building, the blacksmith's shop, and left Pinyon Bluff behind. The silence on the wagon was thick, broken only by the jingle of the harness and the creak of the wagon springs. The trail to Silver Spur Hollow climbed immediately, winding up out of the town's shallow basin into a forest of pinyon pines and gnarled juniper. The air grew cooler, sharper. The red rock formations of the high desert rose around them like the ruins of ancient cities, carved by wind and time. The wagon kicked up a cloud of ochre dust that followed them like a ghost. Rhea's arm throbbed from where Crow had twisted it. She cradled it in her lap, her stomach a cold knot of uncertainty. This man, Hartwell, had spent a fortune on her. She knew the currency of the West. Nothing was given for free. He had bought her, and now she was his property, being transported like a sack of feed. The thought made her feel sick, but then she looked at Benji. The boy was shivering, his eyes fixed on the man's broad back. He was still clutching the dirty, trampled loaf of bread from the street, as if it were a treasure. Silas seemed to feel the boy's stare. Without turning around, he reached under his seat and pulled out a clean flour sack. He held it over his shoulder, not looking back. "That one's for the pigs," he said, his voice level. Rhea, confused, "Did nothing?" Silas shook the bag slightly. "In the sack, girl." Rhea slowly reached into the flour sack. Her fingers brushed against something warm, wrapped in cloth. She pulled it out. It was a fresh, dark loaf, half full, and a small tin of what looked like sorghum or honey. "He's empty," Silas said, still facing forward. "He eats that fast. He'll be sick before we're halfway home." Rhea looked at the fresh loaf. He had this all along. He hadn't just bought the loaf Pritchard threw in the dirt. He had provisioned. "Go on," Silas said, "but tell him to eat slow. Small pieces." Rhea's hands trembled. She unwrapped the cloth. The smell of the bread was sweet and rich. She tore off a small piece, dipped just the edge of it into the tin of dark, golden forest honey, and handed it to Benji. Like he said, "Benji, slow." she whispered. Benji took the bread with both hands and put it to his mouth. He chewed, his eyes closing, a small sound of pure relief escaping his throat. Rhea watched him, her own hunger a distant, secondary ache. She tore a piece for herself, the smallest bite, just enough to stop the shaking in her hands. She kept her gaze on the passing landscape, refusing to look at the back of Silas Hartwell's head. They rode for another hour, climbing higher. The valley opened up below them, a vast, empty expanse of sagebrush and rock. The trail narrowed, forcing them to slow as it skirted a deep ravine. At the bottom, a muddy creek moved sluggishly. A single wooden bridge, its timbers warped and groaning, spanned the gap. As they approached, they saw another group resting on the far side. A work wagon, loaded with steel rails and black powder kegs, was parked haphazardly. A dozen men, rough-looking, with the hard, sun-scorched faces of railroad crew, were drinking coffee and smoking. A man separated himself from the group, stepping toward the bridge to block their path. He was shorter than Silas, but wider, with a thick neck and a face that looked like it had been assembled from leftover parts. He wore a dusty bowler hat and a suit coat over his filthy work shirt. But it was his eyes that held Rhea's attention. They were a pale, flat blue, as cold and empty as a knife blade. This was Vernon Slate. Rhea's breath caught in her throat. She sank back, pulling Benji closer, trying to make herself small. She knew him. She and Benji had spent 2 weeks in a railroad camp near Coyote Flats that Slate had run. She had seen him use a pick handle on a man who had asked for clean water. Slate saw the wagon and his men quieted, their hands moving closer to the pistols holstered at their belts or the rifles leaning against the wagon. Silas did not stop the wagon, but let the mules slow to a walk. Vernon Slate's eyes raked over Silas, dismissed him, and then settled on Rhea. A slow, ugly smile of recognition spread across his face. His gaze was an insult, a physical violation that stripped her bare. He looked her up and down, lingering, and then he looked at Benji. Well, Slate's voice was a gravelly rasp. Look what the wind blew in, the little bread thief from Coyote Flats. Thought you'd run farther than this, girl. He let out a short, harsh laugh. Running with a new man. Are we? Rhea stared at him, her face pale, her body rigid with a fear that was deeper and older than what she had felt in town. Silas Hartwell's body language changed. It was a subtle shift, like a boulder settling. He didn't turn. He just moved his left hand, almost casually, to rest on his thigh, inches from the worn walnut grip of the Colt revolver holstered there. With his right, he nudged Benji, a firm, quiet pressure that pushed the boy behind the protection of his own body. Slate's eyes flickered to Silas's hand, then to his face. The smirk on his lips tightened. He was measuring the man. He saw the stillness, the lack of fear, the economical readiness. He saw the way Silas shielded the boy. For a long, stretched-out second, the only sound was the groaning of the bridge timbers and the rush of the wind through the canyon. No one moved. It was a standoff, a silent negotiation of violence. Slate finally grunted and took a half-step back. Clearing the path, he wasn't afraid. But he was a businessman. This wasn't the time or place. You keep your strays in line. Farmer, Slate spat, his eyes still locked on Rhea. This one's got a habit of costing men money. Silas said nothing. He tapped the reins, and the mules, sensing the release of tension, moved forward onto the bridge. The wagon rumbled over the planks, the sound echoing in the ravine. Rhea did not look back. She kept her eyes forward, but she could feel Vernon Slate's cold gaze on her back until they rounded the next bend. She was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable tremor. You know him, Silas stated. It was not a question. We were at his work camp, Rhea said, her voice barely a whisper. We left as soon as we could. Silas just nodded, his eyes on the trail ahead. The wall of his silence was absolute. Another half-hour passed before they turned off the main trail onto a smaller, nearly invisible track. It led them into a narrow valley, A green slash of cottonwoods and willow that followed a small, clear creek, Silver Spur Hollow. The ranch was not what she expected. It was not a grand operation. It was small, solitary, and meticulously clean. The main house was built of weathered pine, gone silver gray from sun and wind. It was solid, built to last. A large, clean-swept barn stood behind it, its doors perfectly hung. There was a stone well house with a deep, turning windlass, a chicken coop, and a neat, fenced-in vegetable garden, now dormant for the winter. The entire place felt anchored, quiet, and profoundly alone. Silas pulled the wagon up near the house and set the brake. He climbed down, his movements unhurried. "We're here." Rhea lifted a sleeping Benji from the seat. The small piece of bread and the release from terror had exhausted him. He was a dead weight in her arms. Silas led them to the porch. He didn't unlock the door. It was already open. He just pushed it wide and stepped aside. The inside was one large room, dominated by a huge stone fireplace on one end. The kitchen was at the other. It was spotless. A cast-iron stove sat cold, but it was clean, the pots hanging from hooks above it scrubbed bright. A long, scarred wooden table stood in the center. There was a smell of smoked wood, old leather, and coffee. "Put him on the bench by the fire," Silas said, gesturing to a long, cushioned settle. Rhea gently laid Benji down. The boy curled up instantly, his small hand still clutching the rest of his bread. He was, for the first time in months, deeply asleep and safe. Silas was already moving, striking a match and lighting a pre-laid fire in the hearth. The dry wood caught immediately, and a warm, orange light filled the room, pushing back the gray afternoon. "He can stay there. There's a spare room, back through there." He pointed to a closed door. "It's small, but it's warm." Rhea stood in the middle of the room, clutching her shawl. She felt trapped, exposed. "Mr. Hartwell, why that money?" Silas turned from the fire, the new light catching the planes of his face. He looked older than she had first thought. There were deep lines around his eyes. "I had the money. You needed the help," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious transaction in the world. "You and the boy can stay. The room is yours. I'll be in the loft." He gestured to a ladder in the corner. "There's work. You can help with the chickens, the mending, light work, until you're stronger." Rhea's pride, the last thing she owned, flared up. She had been bought, but she would not be kept. "I don't take what I don't earn," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't take charity. I will work for our keep. I can mend. I can cook. I can clean. I can braid rope. Benji, when he's well, he can help. We will pay you back, every cent." Silas looked at her for a long moment. He seemed to be measuring her, not as Slate had, but as a man measuring the grain of a piece of wood. "Fine," he said. "You'll earn your keep. There's potatoes and salt pork in the pantry. You said you can cook. Supper is at sundown." He turned, took his hat from his head, and hung it on a peg by the door. It was a gesture of finality. The arrangement was made. Rhea watched him, her mind racing. He was offering them sanctuary. But the encounter with Slate had rattled her. This world was full of men who offered help with one hand and took with the other. As he moved toward the pantry, he passed a small shelf by the fireplace. On it sat a single, tarnished silver picture frame. Rhea caught a glimpse of it, a formal portrait, a woman with dark, severe hair, and beside her, a small girl, no older than Benji, with wide, serious eyes. Silas's hand went to the frame. His fingers brushed the glass, a gesture so gentle and full of private pain that Rhea felt she had spied on him. He didn't look at the picture. He just closed the frame, laying it face down on the shelf. The movement was quiet, deliberate, like closing a door on a room he never intended to enter again. He said nothing, and continued into the pantry. Rhea let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She looked at Benji, sleeping peacefully in the firelight. She walked over and gently loosened his grip on the bread. Placing it beside him, she found a worn-in quilt folded on a chair and spread it over him. The simple act of covering him in a warm, safe place made her eyes sting. She wiped them angrily. Safety was a luxury, and she hadn't earned it yet. Later that night, the ranch was silent save for the rhythmic creak of the old windmill outside and the chirr of late-season insects. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. In the small back room, Rhea lay on a narrow cot, Benji breathing deeply beside her. She was exhausted, but sleep would not come. She listened. She heard the faint sound of Silas moving in the loft above, the creak of a boot. Then silence. He was up there, a stranger, a man of profound stillness and sudden, expensive actions, a man who hid pictures of dead children. Rhea slipped her hand under the thin, straw-filled pillow. Her fingers found the cold, familiar wooden handle of the small skinning knife she had carried for 3 years. She had stolen it from a drunkard in El Paso who had tried to grab her. She gripped the handle. She was grateful. She was terrified. She would trust the warmth of the fire and the solidity of the roof, but she would not, could not, trust the man who had provided it. Not yet. She would stay, and she would watch. Rhea woke before the light, a habit carved into her by years of sleeping cold. The small room was dark and still, the only sound Benji's slow, deep breathing beside her. For a confused moment, she gripped the handle of the knife under her pillow, her heart seizing with the familiar terror of waking in a strange place. Then she remembered the solid walls, the fire, the man in the loft. She slid from the cot, her bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. She pulled her shawl tight and moved into the main room. He was already there. Silas Hartwell was standing by the stove, a silhouette against the first, pearly gray light in the eastern window. The stove was already lit, the low rumble of a good fire filling the room, and the sharp, rich smell of coffee, a scent of luxury, of stability, was just beginning to bloom in the cold air. He heard her but did not turn. He was focused on a small pot, stirring. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough from sleep. "I can do that," Rhea said, moving forward, eager to establish her utility. "I should have been up. I can make the breakfast." "Coffee's on," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the larger pot. He finished stirring, then moved to the long central table. He set down a steaming bowl of thick cornmeal mush. Beside it, he placed a tin spoon, a small jar of molasses, and a clay pinch pot filled with coarse, pinkish salt. He had not served her. He had made it available. He was respecting her fierce declaration from the night before. She nodded, accepting the unspoken terms. She took the bowl and sat at the far end of the table, turning her back slightly to him as she ate. The mush was hot, thick, and life-giving. The salt was strong, mineral-heavy. She ate slowly, forcing herself to savor the warmth, feeling it spread through her limbs, chasing away the deep, bone-deep chill of months of hunger. Silas poured himself a cup of black coffee and leaned against the wall near the fireplace, drinking it. They did not speak. The silence. Rhea was learning, was his native element. Benji woke an hour later, drawn by the smell of food. He was still shy, hiding behind Rhea, but the waxy, pale look was gone. Color had returned to his cheeks. Silas passed him a small piece of jerky, and the boy, after a hesitant look at Rhea, took it and chewed on it with quiet seriousness. That afternoon, while Rhea was beating dust from the cabin's few rugs, she saw Silas sitting on the porch steps, mending a bridle. Benji sat on the bottom step, watching him. Silas had a cluster of green pinion needles in his hand. He selected one, split it carefully with his thumbnail, and then placed it between his thumbs. Cupping his hands, he blew, a sound, high and piercingly sweet, like a mountain bluebird, cut through the quiet afternoon. Benji's head snapped up, his eyes wide with wonder. Silas, his face impassive, did it again. A different note, shorter, sharper. Benji edged closer. "How?" he whispered. Silas didn't look at him. He just held out another pinion needle. Benji took it. For the next 20 minutes, Silas, in his economical silence, showed the boy. He adjusted the grip of Benji's small, chapped hands. He demonstrated how to purse his lips. Benji's first attempts were just puffs of air. He grew frustrated, his face screwing up. Rhea watched from the doorway, her hands still, ready to step in if Silas showed a flicker of the impatience most men had for children. But Silas was perfectly still. He waited. Again, Silas said, his voice low. Benji tried again. This time a high, thin squeal emerged. It was terrible, but it was a sound. Benji's eyes lit up. He blew again, and the squeal turned into a warble. A laugh, rusty and sudden, burst from Benji's chest. It was the first time Rhea had heard him laugh since their mother died. The sound was so unexpected it made her own throat tighten. Silas looked at the boy, and the corners of his mouth eased, a faint thawing of his stoic expression. "You'll scare the hawks," he said. He went back to mending his bridle. A rhythm established itself in Silver Spur Hollow. It was a rhythm of work, of fair exchange. Rhea held up her end of the bargain with a fierce, quiet pride. Silas showed her how to mix the lye soap, how to check the small herd of Hereford cattle that grazed in the hollow, and how to use the curved awl and waxed thread to repair the split seams on his saddlebags. His instructions were brief, tactile. He didn't explain, he demonstrated. In return, she transformed the house. She scoured the pantry, organized the dried beans and flour. She found a pile of torn canvas grain sacks and, with the tools Silas used for leather, she patched them. She spent the long evenings braiding a new, supple rope from scraps of old ones. She was paying down a debt, silver coin by silver coin, with the currency of her own labor. She learned to read him, his silence, which had at first felt like a wall. She now understood as a language. It was not the cold, dismissive silence of the townsfolk. It was the silence of a man who did not waste movement, breath, or promises. If he said he would mend the fence was mended by noon. If he said the weather would turn, she brought the laundry in. His quiet was not an absence. It was a presence. It was the absolute, reliable weight of his word. It was the silence of a promise being kept. About a week after their arrival, Silas sent her to Pinyon Bluff for supplies. He gave her a list flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, and a small leather pouch heavy with coins. Rhea rode the buckboard into town, her chin high, her back straight. The town saw her coming. As she tied the mules to the hitching post outside the mercantile, the street went quiet. Inside, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, stopped sorting mail. He looked at her, then at the other customers, a pair of women in dark calico dresses. "Help you?" he asked, his voice flat. "I need flour, lamp oil, and coffee," Rhea said, placing the list on the counter. "Mr. Henderson looked at the list, then at her. "Hartwell's money. Is it?" Rhea felt the blood rise to her face. "It's money. It pays for the goods." "Some folks don't like the kind of trade he's bringing in," Henderson said, his voice just loud enough for the women to hear. They whispered behind their hands, their eyes sharp with judgment. Rhea heard the door of the bakery across the street jingle. Nolan Pritchard stepped out, wiping his hands on his apron. He saw her. He saw the mercantile owner's hesitation. "That's her," Pritchard called out, his voice carrying across the street. "The thief, the one the widower Hartwell took in spending his money now, bold as brass." The women in the store flinched and hurried out, gathering their skirts as they passed Rhea, as if she carried a disease. Henderson sighed. "Look, girl, I'm just trying to run a business. I'm trying to conduct a transaction," Rhea said, her voice shaking but firm. "Are you going to sell me the supplies, or am I taking my money elsewhere?" Henderson looked at Pritchard, who was glaring at him. He looked at the heavy pouch on his counter. He gathered the supplies, his movements quick and angry, and shoved them into a sack. He took the money and didn't bother to count the change, just dropped a few small coins into her hand. Rhea walked out, her head high, loaded the buckboard, and drove out of town, the silent judgment of Pinyon Bluff like a physical weight on her shoulders. When she got back to the ranch, Silas was splitting wood. She put the supplies on the table, along with a few coins of change. "They talk," she said, her voice tight. Pritchard. He's turning them against you. He called you. He said you took in a thief. Silas finished his swing, the axe biting deep. He split the log in two. He paused, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. He looked at the supplies. Not at her. Did you get the lamp oil? He asked. Yes, and the flour. Then it don't matter what they say. He stacked the wood, picked up the sack of flour, and carried it into the pantry. He had known the cost of his action in town, and he had paid it without complaint. The cold deepened. The nights grew brittle, the stars sharp as chips of ice. One night, a new sound entered the hollow. A long, mourning howl, answered by another. The sheep in the lower pen began to bleat, a high, frantic chorus of terror. Rhea was awake instantly. In the main room, Silas was already down from the loft, pulling on his boots, his rifle in his hand. Stay inside, he said, checking the rifle's action. Bolt the door behind me. I'm coming, Rhea said, pulling her own boots on over her bare feet. It's wolves. You'll be no help? I can carry a light. I can make noise. I won't let you go alone. He looked at her. A quick, sharp assessment in the moonlight streaming through the window. He saw she was not afraid, but determined. He nodded once, grabbed the pitchfork by the barn door, and the lantern. They moved out into the frozen night. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. They could see them 4, maybe 5, dark, loping shapes circling the flimsy brush pen. Their eyes, green gold in the lantern light, were cold fires. Silas raised his rifle, but the sheep were bunched together, panicked. A shot into the dark was as likely to kill one of his own animals as a wolf. Fire, he said, his voice a low command. They hate fire. He ran to the haystack near the barn. Rhea was right beside him. The loose straw, he said. They didn't need to discuss it. Their movements were perfectly, instinctively aligned. He tore a huge armful of dry straw from the stack. She speared it with the tines of the pitchfork. He struck a match, cupping it against the wind, and lit the straw. It exploded into a torch. The west side, he yelled, grabbing his rifle again as she took the burning fork. I'll take the east, keep it moving. Rhea ran, the heat of the fire on her face, the handle of the pitchfork clutched in her raw hands. She rushed the fence line, shouting, Get away, hey! The wolves snarled, backing away from the sudden light and noise. On the far side, Silas fired a shot into the air. The crack of the rifle echoed off the canyon walls. Rhea thrust the burning straw forward, the embers showering the ground. The wolves, caught between the fire and the gunshot, broke. They were shadows, melting back into the darker shadows of the pinyon forest. They stood in the sudden, echoing silence, breathing hard, their breath pluming in the icy air. The sheep huddled, trembling, but safe. Rhea dropped the smoldering fork and stomped out the last embers. Silas walked over, ejecting the spent cartridge. He looked at her, the lantern light catching the approval in his eyes. You did good, he said. We did, she answered, the we settling between them, solid and warm. Later, back in the house, they sat by the fire, unable to sleep. Benji hadn't even stirred. The shared victory, the adrenaline, had left a different kind in quiet in its wake. You're not scared of much, Silas observed, staring into the flames. There's not much left to be scared of, Rhea said, rubbing her hands together. When you've lost everything, the only thing left to fear is losing what you have, and for a long time, that was just Benji. She looked at the fire. We came from Leadville. My PA was a miner. He died in a cave-in. My ma, she faded. The grief and the lung sickness. She was gone by winter. It's been almost 2 years. Just me and Benji. We went to Coyote Flats. Heard there was work, but it was just men like Vernon Slate. At the name, Silas's head came up. He runs the work camps. She whispered. He pays in scrip. He traps people. Silas nodded grimly. I know the name. I was a blacksmith for the railroad. Before this. Rhea looked at him, surprised. His hands were calloused, strong. She could see it. I worked the line from Santa Fe west, he said, his voice flat, reciting a history he had locked away. "I was good with steel. My wife, Ilara, she was with me. We had a daughter, Lila." He pointed with his chin to the small shelf, where the picture frame lay face down. "She was 5 years old. She loved the smell of the forge. She'd bring me water." He stopped, his throat working. "Smallpox. It came through the camp in 1881. Took her in 3 days. Buried her on a hill overlooking the tracks." He rubbed his face, a gesture of profound weariness. "Ilara, she broke. She said this land was cursed. She blamed me for bringing them here. One morning, she just got on the eastbound stage. Never heard from her again." He looked at Rhea, his eyes stripped bare. "I left the railroad, came here, built this house with my own hands. I thought the quiet would be enough." They sat in that shared silence. The two of them, two people defined by what they had lost. A daughter, a father and mother, a wife, a home. They were two broken, fractured halves of different lives. Rhea looked at the warm stove, the clean floor, the sound of Benji sleeping peacefully in the next room. Silas looked at the hearth, at the mended curtain, at the quiet order she had brought to his empty house. This place, Silver Spur Hollow, had been a refuge for him, a penance. Now, it was becoming something else, a sanctuary. Not just for him, but for them, Rhea realized, with a small jolt, that she hadn't checked the knife under her pillow in 3 nights. The clean yard, the deep well, the warm stove, they were becoming a new kind of faith. The trust built on the ranch was a fragile, new-grown thing, and the world outside the hollow was quick to test it. Rhea, now moving with a quiet confidence, took the buckboard into Pinyon Bluff to post a letter for Silas. She had insisted on maintaining this contact with the town, refusing to be hidden. "We have to show them we aren't afraid." She'd told him. He had simply nodded and given her the mail. As she stood at the post office window, she heard them. 3 voices, low and rough, coming from the alley between the saloon and Pritchard's bakery. She recognized Nolan Pritchard's whining tenor and Jeb Crow's wet growl. The third voice was the one that made her blood freeze Vernon Slate. "The profit share is fine. Vernon, fine," Pritchard was saying, his voice slick with false deference. "But the risk is all on me. Crow here has to process the vouchers, and if the marshal from Las Lomas ever looks, it's our necks. You get your 30%, Baker," Slate rasped. "And you get free labor from the drifters. That's a sweet deal. Crow gets his share for stamping the paper. I get the men. I get my railroad built for half the cost. Everybody wins. Besides, the marshal's got no reason to look. We're running low on vouchers." Crow grumbled. "Need a new batch. I'll have them sent. Just keep processing the vagrancy debts. That's all that matters. Find me more workers." Rhea's hand went cold on the wooden counter. She took her receipt from the postmaster, her mind racing. Vouchers, debt, free labor. She thought of the 30 days Pritchard had demanded of her. It wasn't just spite. It was a business. She walked out into the pale sunlight, her head down, her thoughts churning. She passed the town's public notice board, a plank of warped wood outside the deputy's office. A yellowed piece of paper was tacked there, one she had avoided looking at for weeks. It was a notice of public judgment. Her name was on it. Rhea Calder, crime theft, penalty, 30 days labor. Assigned to N. Pritchard. She had expected to feel shame. Instead, a cold, sharp anger cut through her. She looked closer. At the bottom of the notice was an official-looking seal, pressed into the paper. A faint circle of ink. It was an eagle, clutching arrows. Rhea stared at it, her memory flashing back. She had seen this seal before, the real one, on her father's mining claim, filed in the county office back in Leadville. She remembered him holding it to the light, proud. That's the territorial eagle, Rhea. That makes it law. This was not the same eagle. She looked left, then right. The street was sleepy, with a quick, decisive movement. She tore the notice from the board, folded it, and slipped it into her pocket. That night, she laid the paper on the cabin table under the lamplight. Silas and Benji were outside, Silas showing the boy how to read the stars. Rhea smoothed the paper. She had known it. The eagle's head was turned to the left, toward the arrows. On her father's document, she was almost certain. It had turned to the right, toward the olive branch, and the lettering around the edge. County of San Miguel. The S was too large, and the M was slightly tilted. It was a fake, a crude, arrogant fake, used to scare people who couldn't read, people who were desperate, people like her. They weren't just bending the law, they had manufactured it. When Silas came in, she was waiting. She pointed to the seal. "This isn't real." He took the paper, his eyes narrowing. He rubbed the ink with his thumb. "It's a stamp, not an official press. Where did you see the real one?" "My father's claim. I remember it. This is wrong." "It's enough to get people to work for free," Silas said, his voice grim. "It's slavery, by another name." He looked at her, seeing the fire in her eyes. "You said you saw Slate. He's in this." "He's running it," Rhea said. "He called them vouchers. He's getting his railroad built with men Pritchard and Crow condemned to fake labor." "There are others," Rhea said, a sudden certainty taking hold. "In the railroad camp, there were men who just disappeared. Slate said they ran off, but they were good men. They had families. They wouldn't just leave." She stood up. "I think I know where they might be." She had seen them on her trips to town. A small, sad gathering of men and a few women, huddled in the ruins of the old Spanish mission church just south of town, the one that had burned 10 years prior. They looked like the railroad men, beaten, lost. "We have to go," she said. Silas did not argue. He banked the fire, checked on a sleeping Benji, and pulled his duster from the peg. "Bring your knife. Not for them, for the road." They rode one of the mules, Silas in front, Rhea sitting behind him, her hands resting lightly on his waist. The ruined church was a dark silhouette against a sky brilliant with stars. They tethered the mule in a grove of cottonwoods and approached on foot. A small fire burned in the roofless apse. 6 men and 1 woman were gathered around it, passing a bottle. They looked up, startled, their hands going to rusted tools and knives. A man with a gaunt face and haunted eyes rose. "This is private ground, Mr." Rhea stepped past Silas, into the firelight. "We aren't here for trouble. We're here because of Vernon Slate." The name hung in the air, killing the meager warmth of the fire. The woman, who had a long, scarred face, looked at Rhea with sharp, assessing eyes. It was Alma Reyes, a woman Rhea had seen hauling water at the Coyote Flats camp. "I know you," Alma said, her voice rough. "You're the one who ran. I'm the one who got away," Rhea corrected, her voice steady. "And I'm the one Pritchard tried to give to Slate. I have this." She pulled the notice from her pocket, holding it out. "They're using a fake seal. They're trapping us with false paper." A murmur went through the small group. The gaunt man spat into the fire. "We know. He took my brother. Said he owed the company store for flour. My brother can't read. He made his mark. I ain't seen him in 2 months. He keeps a book," Alma said, her voice low and bitter. "A black ledger. Every name, every debt, every voucher. He keeps it at his warehouse. He boasts about it. Says it's his real bank account." "Where?" Silas asked, his voice a quiet command. "The old supply depot." The gaunt man said, "Out by Bonito Creek, on the abandoned Track 3 line. But it's no use. It's guarded, day and night. 2 men, sometimes 3, and the place is locked up tighter than a drum." While the adults talked, Benji, who had woken and insisted on coming, had been exploring the shadows of the ruin, his pinion whistle in his pocket. He was quiet, used to staying invisible. He was poking a stick in the dirt near where the men had been sitting, and his stick hit something hard. He knelt, digging it out of the loose soil. It was a coin, not a peso, not a dollar. It was dark, heavy. He rubbed the dirt off on his pants. He walked into the firelight, holding it out to Rhea. "Look, it's a funny dollar." Rhea took it. Alma Reyes gasped, leaning in to see. It was a piece of silver, crudely minted. On one side, it was stamped with a large VS. On the other, 1 day's labor. It was slate script. But there was something else, stamped small beneath the letters. A location. Depot 3, Bonito. He dropped it. Alma whispered, her eyes wide, looking at the spot where the gaunt man's friend had been sitting. One of Slate's guards was here, earlier, trying to hire men. He must have dropped it. Silas turned the coin over in his own hand. Depot 3, Bonito Creek. He looked at Rhea. He just told us where to find it. The full moon was 2 nights later. It washed the high desert in a light so bright and cold it looked like a landscape of bone. Benji was asleep. A trusted neighbor's wife sitting with him, one of the few in town who owed Pritchard nothing. Silas and Rhea moved through the pinyon shadows, black shapes in a silver world. They reached the rise overlooking Bonito Creek. Below them, the creek, swollen with early snowmelt from the mountains, rushed cold and fast. On the far bank stood the warehouse, a long, low building of dark timber, its tin roof gleaming like ice in the moonlight. One guard sat on the porch, his rifle across his lap, a bottle at his feet. "We can't cross the bridge," Silas whispered, his breath pluming. "He'd see us a mile off. Then we don't use the bridge." Rhea said. She pointed 50 yards upstream, where the creek narrowed and ran deep between 2 rock walls. The water was a physical shock, a pain so intense it stole her breath. It was liquid ice, the current grabbing at their legs, trying to pull them under. Silas went first, holding a rope he'd brought. Rhea followed, gripping it, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they would break. They emerged on the other side, gasping, soaked to the skin, their clothes freezing to them in seconds. They moved to the back of the warehouse. The air was thick with the smell of tar and creosote. A high window, coated in grime, was their only way in. It was 12 feet off the ground. Silas didn't hesitate. He laced his fingers together. "Your foot, be quick and be quiet." Rhea placed her frozen boot in his hands. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. She tested the window. It was unlocked, but swollen shut. She put all her weight into it, her shoulder aching, and it finally gave with a low, agonizing groan of wood on wood. She slipped inside, landing in darkness, her feet hitting a soft, dusty floor. She turned and helped pull Silas up. He was heavier, and for a moment he dangled, his boots scraping the wall, before he got a grip and levered himself through. They stood in the dark, their hearts hammering, listening. Nothing. The warehouse was one vast, cavernous room, smelling of oil, old burlap, and stale flour. Moonlight streamed in through the high window, illuminating rows of barrels and sacks. "It would be in an office," Rhea whispered. "Where he keeps his papers." They found it in the corner. A small, crude office, walled off with raw planks. A single lantern sat on a desk, unlit. Rhea's fingers fumbled with the matches from her oilskin pouch. They were damp. She scraped one. Nothing. A second. Nothing. The third one sputtered. A tiny blue flame, and she lit the wick. The low, yellow light filled the small space. There was a desk, a chair, and a large, iron-banded chest. "A ratchet lock," Silas breathed, examining it. He looked around, grabbed a steel pry bar from a nearby crate. "Stand back." He jammed the bar into the hasp and put his full weight on it. The wood groaned. The lock shrieked. "It held—" "Again," Rhea urged, her eyes on the door. Silas repositioned the bar. He took a deep breath and threw his entire body into it. There was a sharp, cracking snap, and the hasp tore free from the wood. Rhea threw open the lid. Inside, ledgers, piles of vouchers, and a heavy, cast-iron object wrapped in an oily rag. She unwrapped it. It was the seal, the fake eagle. Silas grabbed the top ledger. He flipped it open. Names, debts, $20 for a shovel, $50 for a tent. He flipped another page. Reyes, Alma, $100, medical. Rhea dug under the ledgers. At the bottom was a slimmer book, bound in red. It wasn't a list of debts. It was a list of names. She ran her finger down the page. Alma Reyes, assigned, track 9. Gomez, Arturo, assigned, powder gang. And then, near the bottom of the last page, a new entry. The ink still dark. Calder, Rhea, marked for retrieval. Hold for V. S. A red line was drawn under her name. She stared at it. The paper, the mark. He wasn't just going to work her. He was going to take her. He had marked her as his. Rhea? Silas's voice was sharp. She heard it then. A low, ringing sound. An alarm. A bell. Outside. Being struck slowly. Then faster. They heard the lock, Silas said, grabbing the red book and the seal. Out! Now! Rhea blew out the lantern, plunging the office into blackness. They ran, stumbling over sacks. The main warehouse door was thrown open, and 2 figures were silhouetted against the moonlight. Who's in there? A voice yelled. Silas didn't pause. He grabbed a 50-pound sack from a nearby stack. Cover your face, he yelled at Rhea. He swung the sack, and with all his blacksmith strength, tore it open. A massive cloud of white flour exploded into the air, instantly filling the moonlit beams with a blinding, choking white fog. The men at the door cursed, coughing. The window go! Silas shoved Rhea toward the back wall. She scrambled onto a barrel, grabbing the window ledge. She heard a shout behind her, a scuffle in the dust. A third man, the guard from the bridge, had come around the side. He lunged through the flour cloud. Silas met him. She saw their shapes collide, a confusion of limbs. Silas! She screamed. Go, I'm behind you, he roared. She pulled herself through the window, not caring how she landed, and fell 12 feet, rolling down a soft sandbank that led to the creek. She came up, gasping, looking back. Silas appeared in the window. As he was climbing out, the guard lunged up from inside, a long skinning knife in his hand. The blade flashed in the moonlight. It sliced across Silas's shoulder as he pushed off the sill. He fell, landing hard beside her. A low grunt of pain forced from his chest. They didn't stop. They scrambled into the icy creek, the water biting at them again. But this time, it was a refuge. They swam, pulling themselves through the current as shouts and a single, wild gunshot echoed behind them. They collapsed on the far bank, hidden in the willows, gasping, frozen, but alive. Silas was leaning against a tree, his left arm held tight to his body. He got me, he breathed. Rhea saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt, black in the moonlight. She ripped a long strip from her own petticoat, her hands shaking so badly she could barely tie the knot. It wasn't enough. She looked at him, at the blood. She tore her own handkerchief, the only clean, good thing she owned, from her pocket. She pressed it tight against the wound, a clean white square against the dark, spreading stain. Hold this, she commanded, her voice fierce. Hold it tight! He pressed his hand over hers, his skin cold, his grip surprisingly strong. Rhea looked back across the water, at the warehouse, at the angry, shouting men. They had the proof, they had the book, and they had been marked. She looked at Silas's blood on her hands, and a cold, hard resolve, purer than any anger she had ever felt, settled in her heart. She leaned in close, her voice a low, trembling whisper that was harder than steel. No one gets to put their mark on me again. The ride back to Pinon Bluff was a cold agony. They stayed off the main track, pushing through the dents, scratching juniper and over rocky ridges, the mule stumbling in the dark. Rhea's clothes were frozen stiff, sharp plates of ice that cracked and scraped her skin. Silas was a dead weight behind her, his good hand gripping the saddle horn, his other arm held tight to his chest. He had bled. He had bled too much. Rhea's mind was a frantic prayer. Just let him hold on. Let them get to town. The ledger, wrapped in the oily rag with the heavy iron seal, was a hard, angular lump tied to the saddle, banging against her leg with every step. They didn't go to the neighbor's house. They didn't go to the ranch. They went to the only place of sanctuary Rhea could imagine, the small adobe house behind the town's white-steepled church. They arrived as the sky was turning from black to a bruised, episcopal purple. Rhea slid off the mule, her legs numb and collapsing under her. She banged on the heavy wooden door with her frozen fist. Reverend Pike, please, open the door." Lights flared inside, bolts were drawn. The door opened, and Reverend Ezra Pike stood there. A tall, thin man in a long nightshirt, his white hair a wild halo. His eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, went from Rhea's desperate, frozen face to the man slumped on the mule. "Good Lord," Ezra whispered. He was 70 years old, but he moved with a sudden, wiry strength. Bring him in, child, quickly!" They half-carried, half-dragged Silas inside, into the Reverend's study. The room was warm, smelling of old paper, leather, and brewing chicory. They laid him on a horsehair sofa near the pot-bellied stove. "He's been cut," Rhea gasped, her teeth chattering. "At Slate's warehouse, we—" "Hush, child," Ezra said, already in motion. He brought a lamp, hot water, and clean linen. "Let me see." He cut away Silas's shirt. The makeshift bandage Rhea had applied was soaked through, a dark, terrible red. The wound beneath was a deep, 9-inch gash across the shoulder, clean, but open. "A knife," Silas grated, his voice strained with pain as Ezra began to clean the wound. He was efficient. "This needs stitches," Ezra said, his face grim. "I was a clerk, Mr. Hartwell, not a surgeon, but I've seen my share." As the Reverend worked, his hands surprisingly steady. Rhea untied the ledger from the saddle. She brought it in, the oily rag still wrapped around the seal, and placed it on Ezra's desk. "This is why," she said. Ezra paused, his needle hovering. He looked at the book, then at her. "They're running a con," Rhea said, her voice low and fast. "Pritchard, Crow, and Slate. They're using fake debt vouchers and a forged county seal to force men into labor. They're enslaving them." Ezra finished the stitch, his lips a thin white line. He tied it off, bandaged the wound tightly, and gave Silas a glass of water. Then he turned to the desk. He wiped his spectacles. He lit a second lamp, flooding the desk with yellow light. He unwrapped the heavy iron seal. He stared at it for a long, silent minute. He ran a finger over the crudely cut eagle. "An abomination," he whispered. His voice was shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, profound rage. "I was the county clerk in Las Lomas for 22 years. I held the true press. I stamped every claim, every deed, every judgment. This is a mockery." "Is it proof?" Rhea asked, her hands clenched. "It is a felony. Miss Calder," Ezra said, his voice hardening. He opened the red ledger, his finger tracing the names. "Alma Reyes, Arturo Gomez, and this." He looked at the list of assignments. "This is conspiracy to commit peonage. This is a federal crime." "So what do we do?" Silas asked, pushing himself up, his face the color of ash. "We take this to Las Lomas," Ezra said, his eyes bright. "We take it to the district court. We bypass the local magistrate, who I suspect is in Slate's pocket. We demand a Ute-Ways marshal. This ledger and this seal will send Nolan Pritchard and Vernon Slate to a federal prison." A heavy, pounding knock rattled the front door. It wasn't a call for help. It was a demand. Rhea's heart stopped. She looked at Silas. Ezra Pike drew himself up, pulled on his black day coat over his nightshirt, and walked to the door. He opened it. Jeb Crow stood on the step, his hand on his pistol. Behind him, on the street, stood Nolan Pritchard, his face pale and twisted with fury. And fanned out behind Pritchard were 3 of Vernon Slate's hard-faced railroad men, the guards from the warehouse. "Morning, Reverend," Crow said, his voice lacking its usual bluster. He was nervous. "We're looking for the girl, Rhea Calder. She is a guest in my house, deputy," Ezra said, blocking the doorway. "She's a criminal," Pritchard shrieked, shoving himself forward. "She and Hartwell, they broke into Mr. Slate's private property last night. They're thieves, burglars. We've got witnesses. The accusation hung in the cold morning air. A crowd was already gathering. The noise had woken the street. Faces appeared in windows. Men stepped out of the saloon. "This is a lie," Rhea said, stepping up behind Ezra. "Is it?" Pritchard sneered. "We saw you. We've got the broken lock you ransacked Mr. Slate's office caused thousands of dollars in damages." He was rebuilding the narrative, twisting their discovery into a simple, brutal crime. "I have a warrant for her arrest," Crow said, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket. It was already signed. "For burglary, trespass, and destruction of property." He reached out to grab Rhea's arm. "No." The word was quiet, but it cut through Pritchard's whining. Silas Hartwell was standing in the doorway, framed by the dark hall. He was unarmed. His left arm was in a pristine white sling, a stark contrast to his bloody, muddy clothes. He looked like a man who had already died and had nothing left to lose. "This is law. Hartwell," Crow blustered. "Stand aside. You're not taking her," Silas repeated. "He's an accomplice," Pritchard yelled to the crowd. "He was with her. He's just as guilty." Crow looked at Silas, then at the hard-faced men behind Pritchard. He drew his pistol. "I'm taking her in. Move, Hartwell, or I'll arrest you for obstruction." He motioned to his side. A dilapidated prison wagon, a small barred cage on wheels, was parked by the street. He grabbed Rhea's arm. "No," she cried, pulling back. "Get in the wagon, girl!" The sound of hooves on hard-packed earth. Fast. Silas's horse, the big roan, burst from the alley beside the church. Silas, moving with a speed that defied his injury, had gone through the house, out the back, and to the stable. He planted the horse directly between Rhea and the wagon. The animal was massive, its eyes rolling, its breath pluming. It was a wall of horse flesh. Silas, sitting tall in the saddle with his one good arm, looked down at Jeb Crow. "I said," Silas spoke, his voice dangerously low, "you're not taking her." The street went dead silent. It was a standoff. A wounded man on a horse against a deputy, a baker, and 3 hired guns. The townsfolk watched, frozen, trapped between the law they knew and the justice they feared. Crow's hand tightened on his gun. "This is your last chance. Hartwell." "They're lying." The voice was high, thin, and cracking with terror, but it was clear as a bell. Everyone turned. Benji was standing on the steps of the post office across the street. He must have heard the commotion from the neighbor's house and run. He was trembling from head to foot, his face white, tears streaming down his cheeks. But his small fist was raised. "They're lying," he shouted again. "Mr. Pritchard is a liar. He tried to steal my sister. They're all liars." Pritchard's face went purple. "Someone shut that brat up." "He's right." A new voice, a woman's, sharp and strong. Alma Reyes pushed through the crowd, her face a mask of cold fury. She strode into the open space and stood beside Rhea, facing Crow. "Get back, Alma." Crow snarled. "This ain't your concern." "It is my concern," Alma said. Her hand went to the high collar of her worn dress. With one sharp pull, she ripped the fabric down, exposing the skin of her shoulder and collarbone. A collective gasp went up from the women in the crowd. A long, puckered scar, white and silver, ran from her neck to her shoulder, the marks of a boot heel stamped into the flesh. "This," Alma said, her voice ringing in the silence, "is Vernon Slate's concern. This is what I got when I asked for my husband's pay. This is what interest on flour looks like." She pointed at Rhea. "The boy is right. The girl is right. They're using fake paper to steal us, to steal our husbands and our sons." "He took my brother." The gaunt man from the church stepped forward. "Said he owed for a shovel he never bought." "My son," another woman cried out, stepping off the boardwalk. "He was sent to Track 9. I ain't heard from him in 4 months." One by one, they stepped forward. 3, then 5, then a dozen. The railroad families, the poor, the invisible. They formed a half circle. Their faces, pinched with fear moments before, now hardening with a shared, desperate anger. They weren't a mob. They were witnesses. Jeb Crow lowered his pistol. He looked at Pritchard. He looked at Slate's men. His authority was gone, evaporated. The warrant in his hand was just a piece of paper. Pritchard saw it. He was a weasel, not a wolf. He saw the crowd. He saw Alma's scar. And he saw the unblinking eyes of Silas Hartwell. He panicked. Now! Now! Let's not be hasty, he cried, his voice suddenly high and conciliatory. No one is saying there aren't discrepancies. Accounts to be settled. He was backpedaling, trying to find safe ground. But a break-in, he insisted, trying one last time. That is a serious charge, a matter for a judge. Crow seized the opening. That's right. This ain't for the street to decide. Pritchard, trying to look official, pointed a shaking finger at Rhea. We'll settle this town court this afternoon. Judge Miller can hear all the evidence. He was buying time. Time to get word to Slate. Time to change the story. He turned and practically ran back to the safety of his bakery. Crow, holstering his weapon, motioned for his men to fall back. This afternoon, he shouted, his voice trying to sound firm. The court will hear it. Don't none of you leave town. He retreated, his men pulling back with him, melting into the saloon. The confrontation was over, but the air was still charged. The crowd did not disperse. They gathered in small, buzzing knots, whispering, watching. Rhea ran to Benji, pulling him off the steps and into an embrace so tight he squeaked. You were so brave. Oh, Benji, you were so brave. She looked up. Silas had dismounted. He was leaning heavily against the horse, the adrenaline fading, leaving him pale and weak. The white bandage on his shoulder was already showing a small, dark bloom of red. Rhea's stomach was a cold knot of fear. They were trapped. A town court with a judge loyal to Pritchard, and Slate was on his way. Silas met her gaze. He saw her panic. He pushed himself off the horse and walked to her, his good hand resting on Benji's head. He looked at Ezra, who was still standing in his doorway, holding the red ledger. He's stalling, Silas said, his voice low. He sent for Slate. They'll try to bury this. What do we do? Silas, Rhea whispered. They'll have guns. They'll have the judge. He looked at her, his eyes clear and steady. He nodded toward the ledger. We have the truth. He wants a court. We'll give him one. He reached out, his gloved hand resting on her arm, his thumb brushing the fabric. We win this with the truth. Rhea, not with guns. She looked at him, at his calm, hard certainty. She looked at Alma, who was standing watch, her arms crossed. She looked at Benji, who was no longer crying but watching his sister, his expression full of a new, fierce trust. The fire she had felt in the warehouse, the cold rage of being marked, settled into a hard, bright resolve. She was no longer running. She was no longer hiding. She put her arm around Benji and nodded at Silas. This afternoon. Let them come. By 2 p.m, the town saloon was unrecognizable. The tables had been pushed back. The floor swept clean of sawdust and spittoons. Every bench, chair, and crate from the mercantile had been dragged in to accommodate the crowd. The air was thick, suffocating. It smelled of unwashed bodies, stale whiskey, old tobacco, and the nervous sweat of a community holding its breath. At the front, behind a rickety table draped with a folded American flag, sat Judge Miller. He was an interim appointee, a man whose legal experience came from running a failed freight business. He was pale, his hands visibly shaking as he shuffled papers. His eyes kept darting to the back of the room, where Vernon Slate's railroad men stood, their arms crossed, their presence a promise of violence. Rhea, Silas, and Benji sat in the front row, flanked by Ezra Pike and Alma Reyes. Silas, his face pale but set like stone, had his wounded arm in its clean white sling. He looked straight ahead, his stillness a defiant counterpoint to the room's electric tension. This court is in session. Judge Miller stammered. We are here to hear charges of burglary and destruction of property against Miss Rhea Calder and Mr. Silas Hartwell. Nolan Pritchard stepped forward, his small body puffed up with self-importance. He was enjoying this. Your Honor, this is a simple case. We have witnesses who saw them break into Mr. Slate's private warehouse. But this ain't her first crime. He produced a folded piece of paper with a flourish. This is a confession, Your Honor, signed by the girl herself, 2 months ago, admitting to a long history of vagrancy and theft. She's a career criminal. He handed the paper to Jeb Crow, who handed it to the judge. Miller unfolded it, squinting. This does appear to be a signed confession. Ezra Pike stood up. He was no longer just a reverend. He was the county clerk, and this was his domain. Your Honor, may I examine that document? Ezra took the paper to the window, holding it up to the weak afternoon light. He studied it, his face impassive. Your Honor, Ezra said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the packed room. This is a fascinating piece of fiction. Pritchard turned red. That is her signature. It is legal. The signature is indeed. Ezra agreed smoothly. But it is not original to this document. It has been grafted, lifted from another paper, most likely a hotel register or a work roll, and pressed onto this one. He pointed. If you look at the light, you can see the outline of the paper it was cut from. Furthermore, he continued, pulling a small jeweler's loop from his pocket, the date on this confession is from 2 months past. The ink used for that date is a standard iron gall, but the signature, he peered closer, is written in an aniline ink, a batch that was not even available in this territory until the last supply wagon, which arrived. When was it, Mr. Henderson? The mercantile owner in the back, trapped, mumbled. Tuesday, Ezra repeated. A 2-month-old document, signed with ink that is 2 days old. I move that this forgery be stricken. Judge Miller, sweating, his eyes darting to Slate's men, had no choice. The logic was irrefutable. The document is dismissed. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Pritchard's case had just collapsed. And now, Your Honor, Ezra said, his voice gaining strength, we will address the true crime in Pinyon Bluff. He unwrapped the heavy, oil-stained bundle and, with a thud, placed the fake iron seal on the judge's desk. This, Your Honor, is the instrument of that crime. It's a tool, Pritchard blustered. A shipping stamp. Is it? Rhea's voice, clear and steady, cut through his... She stood up, and from her pocket, she unfolded a thick, yellowed, and cracked document. It was her father's old mining claim, the one he had prized, the one she had carried from camp to camp. This, she said, laying it on the desk next to the seal, is the real territorial seal, stamped in Leadville, 1879. Ezra Pike stepped forward, assuming the role of the expert. Your Honor, and citizens of Pinyon Bluff, as your former county clerk, I ask you to look. A forgery is like any sin. It reveals itself in its imperfections. He pointed. First the eagle, on the true seal. The eagle's head faces right toward the olive branch, a symbol of peace. On this counterfeit, it faces left, toward the arrows, a symbol of war. Second, he continued, the lettering. On the true seal, the words Territory of New Mexico are evenly spaced. On this one, the M and W are tilted, struck by an unsteady, criminal hand. And third, Ezra said, his voice rising with cold anger, the shield, the true seal bears 13 stripes for the 13 colonies. This forgery, this insult to our nation, has only 12. A collective gasp. This was not hearsay. This was iron and ink. This seal, Ezra declared, was used by Nolan Pritchard and Jeb Crow to issue false judgments, to steal labor, to create a system of slavery. Lies, Pritchard shrieked. She's a thief. She stole that, too. Was my payment also a lie? Alma Reyes stood up. She walked to the desk, her scarred face held high. She placed a small, crumpled receipt on the desk. My bill, from Pritchard's Bakery, for flour and salt. You see at the bottom, paid in full, 2 sacks of wool, 1 dozen eggs. She then slammed a yellowed voucher down beside it. And this is the labor sentence Jeb Crow served me the very next day, for the same bill, the one I had already paid. The room exploded. Men were standing, shouting at Pritchard. At Crow, the facade of law had crumbled, revealing the rotten wood frame beneath. Judge Miller was pounding his gavel, his eyes wide with panic. Order, order! The main doors of the saloon slammed open, crashing against the walls. The noise stopped instantly. Vernon Slate stood there. He was flanked by 2 men, their long dusters swept back to reveal the heavy Colts on their hips. These were Blue Canyon boys, hired guns known for clearing railroad camps, not for observing legal decorum. Slate strode into the room, his boots heavy on the plank floor. He walked straight to the judge's table, shoved Ezra Pike aside, and slammed his open palm down on the desk. The entire table jumped, the fake seal rattling. "This farce is over." Slate's voice was a roar of pure, unfiltered power. "This is not a court, it's a circus. These are my employees." He jabbed a finger at Alma. "And this," he pointed at Rhea, "is a thief who broke into my property. I'm taking her." His 2 men moved, fanning out, their hands hovering over their holsters, creating a lethal space around the front of the room. Judge Miller looked like he might faint. Pritchard smiled, his relief palpable. Silas Hartwell, who had been silent, watching, now stood up. He moved slowly, not with weakness, but with a terrible, deliberate calm. He stepped out from the bench, into the open space between Slate's men and the table. His left arm was in its sling, useless. His right hand was at his side, empty. He was an open target. He did not look at Slate. He looked at Judge Miller. "Anyone," Silas said, his voice low but carrying with the resonant chill of forged steel, "who obstructs the course of justice in this room is testifying to their own guilt." Slate's men tensed. One of them, a man with a scarred lip, unhooked the leather thong on his holster. But something else was happening. In the crowd, the town blacksmith, a man built like his own anvil, stood up. He didn't say a word. He just moved into the aisle, blocking the path to the door. Near the back, the mule skinner and 2 ranchers who had been watching from the bar also rose. They didn't draw. They just stood. They shifted, a solid, silent mass of denim and canvas. Closing the circle, they were no longer spectators. They were a wall. The air in the room changed. The power, which had flowed from the barrels of Slate's guns, had just swung back to the community. Judge Miller saw it. He was trapped. He looked at Slate's furious, murdering face. He looked at the hard, unmoving faces of the townsmen. And he looked at the cold, irrefutable proof on his desk. The judge, a weak man, chose the only path available escape. He grabbed his gavel and pounded it, a desperate, frantic rattling. This is beyond this court. The evidence, the conflicting testimony, the federal nature of these documents. He was babbling, but he was finding his way. "This matter is beyond the authority of Pinyon Bluff 1. I defer, I rule that all evidence, the ledgers, the seal, the testimony, be transferred to the district court in Las Lomas immediately, within 48 hours. He pointed a shaking finger at Ezra. "Reverend Pike will deliver these items. Deputy Crow will provide an escort. This hearing is adjourned." Slate was frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been beaten, not by a gun, but by a rule. He had lost control. His rage was volcanic. He looked at the judge, at the blacksmith, at Silas. He knew he was outnumbered, not by guns, but by will. "Disperse," he snarled at his men. He turned, his heavy coat swirling. He started for the door, which the townsmen now grudgingly cleared. He stopped, and his head turned. His eyes found Rhea. It was a look that stripped away all pretense of law or civilization. It was not anger. It was a cold, reptilian promise. It said, "The court is a game. I am not. I will have what is mine." He held her gaze for 3 long, chilling seconds. Then he turned and was gone, his gunmen trailing in his wake. Leaving the saloon in a stunned, cold silence, the journey back to Silver Spur Hollow was silent. The crowd, having found its voice, now watched them go with a new, uncertain respect. Ezra Pike had taken the ledger and the seal, locking them in the church safe, promising to ride for Las Lomas at first light. But the small victory in the saloon felt hollow. Slate's final look had poisoned it. It wasn't an act of law. It was an act of vengeance postponed. The rain started just after sundown. It was not a gentle shower, but a cold, driving autumn storm that turned the dry arroyos into muddy torrents and drummed on the cabin roof with a frantic, relentless rhythm. Inside, the cabin was an island of warm, yellow light. Benji, exhausted by the day's terror and his own sudden bravery, had fallen asleep on the settle, curled under 2 quilts, the sound of the rain a lullaby. Rhea, however, could not rest. She stood by the window, peering out into the black, streaming darkness. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every creak of the old house sounded like a lock being tested. "He won't come tonight," Silas said from his chair by the fire. "Not in this. Slate is a businessman. He won't risk his paid men in a flash flood. He'll wait." "He'll wait on the road to Las Lomas," Rhea whispered, not turning. "He'll wait for Ezra, and for us." The look he had given her was burned into her memory. "I will have what is mine." Silas said nothing for a moment. The only sounds were the rain and the soft snick of a needle passing through heavy fabric. Rhea turned. He was sitting in his one good chair, his wounded shoulder propped on a cushion. The firelight illuminated his strong hands, his face drawn with fatigue. With his one good right hand, he was sewing. He was mending her cloak, the one that had been torn on the night of the warehouse raid. He had a piece of dark canvas, and he was applying a patch, his stitches, for a blacksmith, surprisingly small and even. He worked with a slow, careful concentration, his brow furrowed, each pull of the thread a deliberate, thoughtful act. She watched him, this quiet, solitary man, this male widow, as the town called him. He had faced down a deputy, an angry mob, and a killer's hired guns, all for her. And now, he was mending her clothes. She moved from the window and sat on the low stool near the hearth, close to the fire's warmth, close to him. "You should be resting," she said, her voice soft. "Your arm. This is rest," he replied, not looking up. He held the fabric to the light, inspecting his work. "Idle hands make for a loud mind. In this rain, it gives a man too much time to think." She looked at the patch, the neat, strong stitches. "You're good at that. Mending harness is just like mending anything else," he said. "You find the tear. You make it stronger than it was before." He tied off a thread. Rhea reached out, her fingers tracing the edge of the canvas patch. It was rough, sturdy. It would hold. She was tracing the outline of her own life, a life of torn scraps and desperate patches. "I keep thinking," she said, her eyes on the fire, "that I brought this all on you. Your quiet, your valley. I brought the wolves. I brought Slate. This valley was never safe." "Rhea," he said, setting the cloak in his lap. "It was just empty. There's a difference. An empty place is just waiting for the worst to come in. I had forgotten that." She nodded, understanding. "I know what empty is. After my mother died, it was just me and Benji. We were a hole, a space where a family was supposed to be, every day, just trying to keep the edges from caving in." Silas looked down at his own hand, the one that held the needle. "My empty had a name, Lila." He touched the picture frame on the shelf, still face down. "And Alara, it's a different kind, the kind you build yourself, beam by beam. You wall yourself in until the silence is so loud you can't hear anything else." He turned his gaze to her, his eyes clear in the firelight, stripped of all defenses. "It wasn't quiet in here, Rhea, not until you and the boy came." They looked at each other, the two of them, the man who had lost his world and the woman who had never had one. Two jagged, broken edges, exposed in the light of the fire, And in that moment, they saw how their empty spaces fit. They saw how the sharp, lonely angles of their lives, when set together, made something whole. The rain hammered the roof, a deafening drum, as if the sky were trying to break in, to wash them all away. The wind howled in the chimney. Benji stirred on the settle, muttering in his sleep, and burrowed deeper into the blankets. His breathing was deep and even. He was safe. He was warm. Ria's throat tightened. This was home, not the walls or the roof. It was this man and this boy and this circle of warmth. She looked up at Silas. Her heart was a frantic, painful knot in her chest, fear for the morning, gratitude for this night. Her lips parted, but she had no words. He saw the look. He saw the tears glistening on her lower lashes. He saw the tremor in her chin. His own expression, so often guarded, softened. He hesitated, a half-second of doubt. He was not a man who took. He was a man who had only ever lost. She gave him his answer, a small, almost imperceptible nod, a lowering of her eyes, a catching of her breath. Yes, he raised his good right hand, the one that was calloused from the forge, scarred from hot steel. He did not reach for her. He did not grab. He lifted his hand and touched her cheek, just with the back of his knuckles. A blacksmith's caress, rough and chapped, but so tender it made her want to weep. It was a question, not a claim. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes, a single tear escaping, tracing a path through the grime on her face. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. The kiss was not what she expected. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of a lonely man. It was solid. It was warm. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the faint, metallic tang of his work. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. It was the end of a long, cold run. It was a promise of shelter. It was slow, and it was sure, and it was the first safe thing she had felt in her entire life. Her hands came up, not to pull him closer, but to anchor herself. One hand rested on the solid wall of his chest, feeling the steady, slow beat of his heart. The other, lighter, found his bandaged shoulder. He winced, a sharp intake of breath. She pulled back instantly, her eyes flying open, horrified. "Your arm, I'm sorry, It's all right," he breathed, his voice a low rumble. He did not move away. "It's all right." He did not kiss her again. Instead, with his one good arm, he guided her, drawing her closer. She went, not falling, but folding into him. She rested her head against his chest, her ear over his heart. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her steady. It was not a lover's desperate, passionate embrace. It was the embrace of survivors. It was the embrace of two people who had stood back to back against the world and had not broken. They stood like that for a long time, held in the circle of the firelight. The storm raged outside, a wild, chaotic thing. Inside, there was only the sound of the crackling logs, the rush of the wind in the chimney, and the quiet, steady rhythm of two people breathing in time. She was trembling, the reaction to the day, the fear, the cold, all of it catching up to her. He just held her, his hand rubbing slow, comforting circles on her back, his calloused palm catching on the rough weave of her dress. After a long time, the trembling subsided. The tension did not leave her, but it eased. The fear was still there, but it was no longer a cold, solitary thing. It was shared. She shifted, not to move away, but to find a more solid hold. She pressed her forehead against the warm wool of his shirt, against the solid bone and muscle of his chest. It was her choice, her pace. This was not a surrender. It was an arrival. He understood. His arm just held her, a silent promise. "I am here. I am not leaving. Finally." Gently, he guided her to the long settle by the fire. They sat down, side by side, their shoulders brushing. The warmth of the fire bathed their faces. He released her, and the small space between them felt cold again. He reached out with his good hand, not to her, but setting it palm up on the wooden bench that separated them. An invitation. Rhea looked at his hand. It was a map of his life. Scars from the forge, calluses from the axe, strength that had held a horse against a mob, and gentleness that could sew a patch on a torn cloak. She placed her own hand in his. Her fingers were small, chapped, but strong in their own way. His hand closed around hers. A warm, solid, unshakable grip. They sat there, leaning against the back of the settle, shoulders touching, their hands locked together. They watched the fire burn down, its embers glowing like 1,000 promises, as the rain hammered the roof, washing the world clean. In the small room behind them, Benji slept on, safe, and for the first time in his life, truly home. The rain stopped an hour before dawn, leaving the world scoured and cold, the air tasting of wet stone and pine. There was no discussion of waiting. To wait was to let Slate set the terms. Ezra Pike met them at the mouth of the hollow, mounted on a sturdy mule, a heavy oilskin satchel containing the ledger and the seal strapped in front of him. Alma Reyes was there, too, a lever-action Winchester rifle resting in the crook of her arm, her face set. Their group was small, a desperate delegation. Silas, his left arm bound tightly to his chest, rode his roan, his good right hand resting on his thigh, near his colt. Rhea was beside him on the buckboard wagon. Benji bundled between her and Alma. Rhea handled the reins, her knuckles white. She had her small knife, and she had the rope she had braided, now coiled thick and heavy under the seat. "He won't let us reach the main road," Silas said, his voice low as they moved out. "I know," Ezra replied, his eyes scanning the high ridges, already visible in the gray morning light. "He'll try to stop us at the Narrows. Chimney Narrows." It was the only way to Las Lomas without adding 50 miles to the journey. It was a gash in the high rock, a bottleneck barely wide enough for a wagon, with sheer sandstone cliffs rising 300 feet on either side. It was a perfect trap. They rode in silence for 2 hours. The sun was up, but it offered no warmth, only a harsh light that exposed them on the open trail. Benji, wide-eyed, held onto Rhea's arm. He had not spoken a word. As they approached the entrance to the Narrows, Silas held up his good hand. The party halted. The wind, whistling through the pass, was the only sound. "He's in there," Silas said. "Up high, both sides." "How do you know?" Rhea whispered, her heart hammering. "The birds," Silas said. "They're not flying." He looked at Ezra. "We can't go through, and we can't go back." Ezra nodded grimly. "We can't." Silas turned his horse. "There's a dry wash, a creek bed, about 200 yards back. It runs parallel to the Narrows. It's low ground. It will get us past the worst of it." He didn't wait. He led them, urging the roan off the trail, down a steep, crumbling embankment into a wide, sandy arroyo, littered with boulders and dead cottonwood branches. The wagon buckboard lurched and groaned, the wheels sinking into the damp sand. But Rhea kept the mules moving. They were 100 yards into the wash, hidden from the high trail. When the first shot cracked, the sound was sharp, definitive. It wasn't aimed at them. It was a signal. It was followed by a shout from the ridge above, a voice thin with distance and anger. They had been seen. A second shot, and this time the bullet screamed. It ricocheted off the canyon wall above their heads, sending a shower of red dust and sandstone chips down onto the wagon's canvas cover. Benji let out a small, terrified cry. Alma shoved him down, flat onto the wagon bed. "Stay down. Nino, stay flat." She shielded his small body with her own, her rifle pointed up at the ridge. "They're coming down!" Silas yelled. He pointed. 3 men, the Blue Canyon boys, were scrambling down the rock face, trying to get a clear shot into the wash. "Keep moving," Silas ordered Rhea. "Get the wagon behind that outcropping." Rhea snapped the reins, the mules panicking, pulling the heavy wagon through the sand. Another bullet thwacked into the wooden side of the buckboard, splintering the pine. Silas dismounted, pulling his own rifle from its scabbard. He was trying to aim one-handed, his wounded shoulder making his movements clumsy and slow. He was too exposed. "Silas!" Rhea cried out. He saw the men closing. He looked at the damp sagebrush, the ground still dark from the night's rain. "The smoke!" he yelled. "Give me cover." Ezra understood. He was off his mule in a second, his old hands grabbing the dampest clumps of sage. "The matches! Alma!" Alma threw him her match safe. Silas struck one. It was a slow, sputtering start. The sage was wet. It sizzled, producing a thin, useless wisp. "It won't catch," Ezra said, his voice tight with panic. Rhea had the reins in one hand. With the other, she reached under the seat and pulled out a tin, the lamp oil. "Here," she tossed it to Ezra. He didn't hesitate. He doused the pile of sage. Silas struck another match and threw it. The sagebrush exploded. It wasn't a fire. It was a volcano of thick, acrid, choking white smoke. The wind in the wash caught it instantly, swirling it into a dense, blinding fog that filled the arroyo from wall to wall. Coughing, shouts. The men on the ridge were blind. "Now! Rhea, move!" Silas roared, grabbing his horse's bridle. Rhea whipped the mules, driving them forward through the smoke, the wagon wheels screaming. Alma, her eyes streaming, was coughing, her rifle pointed blindly at the rock wall. They burst out of the smoke cloud into the clear, cold air. Just as the canyon began to widen, they were almost through. But one of the gunmen had been smarter. He hadn't come down the cliff. He had run along the ridge, parallel to them, and was now sliding down the embankment in front of them, cutting them off. He was 20 yards away, a big man with a scarred lip, the same one from the saloon. He raised his rifle, taking his time, a cruel smirk on his face. He had them. Rhea saw him. Alma saw him. But he was focused on Silas, the bigger threat. Rhea let go of the reins. "Alma, take them?" Before Alma could react, Rhea was on her feet. She grabbed her coiled rope. She didn't have a gun. She didn't need one. She pulled a length of it free, the thick braid heavy in her hand. The man was leveling his rifle. With a single, practiced motion, the same motion she used to rope a stray calf. The same motion Silas had taught her, she swung the rope, not the loop, but the heavy, knotted end. She threw it underhand, a flat, fast snake of hemp. It hit the man's shins with a thwack that echoed in the wash. His legs were taken out from under him. He went down hard, his rifle discharging into the sky, the shot deafening. He fell backward, his head cracking against a boulder. He lay still. "Rhea," Silas yelled, stunned. Rhea didn't pause. She jumped from the still-moving wagon, the small skinning knife in her hand. She was on the man in a second. She sliced a length from her rope, her hands a blur. She had watched Silas mend harness for weeks. She knew his knots. She hog-tied the man's wrists and ankles with a diamond hitch, a knot that only tightened with struggle. She was fast, efficient, and furious. She finished, pulling the last knot so tight it bit into his skin. She stood up, breathing hard, the small knife in her hand. Alma had the wagon stopped. Benji was peering over the side, his eyes wide. Ezra Pike looked at the man on the ground, and then at Rhea, with something like awe. Silas rode up, his rifle lowered. "That's a good knot." "You taught me," Rhea said, her voice shaking, but not from fear. She picked up the man's rifle and his pistol. She checked the chambers, then handed the rifle to Ezra. She kept the pistol, shoving it into the waistband of her skirt. "We're off the main road," Silas said, his face grim. "They'll be watching it. We have to cut across the hills." He pointed. "Through the junipers. It'll be slow, but it's the only way." The rest of the day was a slow, agonizing crawl. They left the wash, forcing the wagon up steep, rocky inclines, through thick, scratching forests of juniper. The wheels of the buckboard, not meant for this, groaned in protest. One of them split, and Silas and Ezra had to spend an hour binding it with rope. Silas was fading. The ride had reopened his wound. His face was a waxy gray color, and he was leaning heavily on the saddle horn. By late afternoon, they were all near collapse. The mules were spent. Benji was crying quietly in the back of the wagon. They came over a rise, and Ezra let out a cry of relief. Below them, in a small, wind-blown bowl, was a single, tiny building. The old Pony Express station, abandoned 10 years ago. As they got closer, they saw a thin wisp of smoke coming from its chimney. An old man with a long white beard and the leathery skin of a desert tortoise stepped out, a shotgun in his hands. "That's far enough," he called. "We mean no harm." "Amos," Ezra Pike called out, raising his hand. "It's Ezra Pike. We're on our way to Las Lomas. We've got trouble." The man, Amos, squinted. He lowered the shotgun. "Ezra, you look like you've been dragged through hell backwards." He saw the split wheel. He saw Silas, slumped in the saddle. He saw the grim, exhausted faces of Rhea and Alma. He didn't ask questions. "Water in the trough for the animals. You." He pointed at Rhea and Alma. "Get the boy inside. You." He pointed at Ezra. "Help me with him." He and Ezra helped Silas off the horse and into the small, one-room station. It was clean, warm, and smelled of bacon. Amos gave them water and a pot of beans, and he said nothing as they ate. While Silas rested, his eyes closed, Ezra explained, his voice low and urgent. "Slate's men. Amos, they're watching the main road." Amos nodded, chewing on a piece of jerky. He went to a map tacked on his wall, a hand-drawn thing of yellowed paper. "He'll be watching the main pass." Amos said, "He won't be watching the sheep trail." He traced a thin, wavering line with his finger. "It's narrow, but it'll get you there. Comes in behind the town, by the old tannery. He'll never see you." He tore the section of map from the wall and handed it to Ezra. He went to a cupboard, pulled out a full skin of water, and a canvas sack of jerky and hardtack. He gave it to Rhea. "You've got maybe 3 hours of light." Amos said, "Go, and Godspeed, Reverend." They were on the road again in 20 minutes. The shortcut was a goat track, but it was clear, and it was safe. They entered Las Lomas as the last light of day was painting the sky a deep, bruised purple. The town was twice the size of Pinyon Bluff. It was built of stone, not wood, a place of permanence. The district courthouse was a 2-story, fortress-like building of heavy, red sandstone, its bell tower stark against the twilight. The bell was ringing, a deep, copper toll calling the town to evening prayers. They were dirty, exhausted, and bleeding. But they had made it. As they pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the courthouse steps, the main doors opened. Vernon Slate stepped out. He was not in his rough railroad clothes. He was wearing a new black wool suit, clean and pressed. He looked civilized. Beside him stood a man in a bowler hat, carrying a leather satchel, a lawyer. Slate had not expected them. He had clearly ridden here immediately after the hearing, taking the fast road, expecting his men to have solved his problem on the trail. His face, when he saw them, was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He saw their wagon. He saw their rifles. He saw they were all alive. He saw the oilskin satchel in Ezra's hand. He said nothing. He simply watched them, his mask of civilization cracking, revealing the killer beneath. Ezra Pike ignored him. The old reverend, his back straight, walked past Slate as if he were a pile of refuse. He led the small, broken group up the courthouse steps. A woman was waiting in the doorway, drawn by the bell. She was in her 40s, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a simple, professional dress and held a stack of files. Her eyes were the sharpest, most intelligent Rhea had ever seen. This was May Delaney, the district attorney. She looked at the battered group. She looked at Silas, wounded. She looked at Rhea, covered in dust, a pistol still in her belt. She looked at the bound, sleeping child in Alma's arms. Then her eyes went to Ezra Pike. "Reverend, what in God's name has happened?" Ezra held up the satchel. "We have an appointment with you, Mrs. Delaney. We've brought evidence of slavery, forgery, and conspiracy, and we've brought witnesses." May Delaney's eyes flickered past him, to Vernon Slate, who was still standing on the pavement, his lawyer muttering at his side. A look of cold, professional understanding passed over her face. She stepped aside. "Get them inside, get them water, and get that man." She pointed at Silas. To a doctor. She took the heavy satchel from Ezra's hands. My office. Reverend, now. That night, the five of them sat on the cold, sandstone steps of the courthouse. A U.S. Marshal, dispatched by May Delaney, now stood guard at the door. Benji was asleep, his head in Rhea's lap. Silas's arm had been properly cleaned and stitched by a real doctor, his sling fresh. The street was quiet. They were safe. Rhea looked at the gas lights, at the solid, immovable buildings of the law. He looked so clean, like a gentleman. They always do, just before the hanging, Alma said bitterly, checking the action on her rifle. Silas looked over at Rhea, the new gaslight softening the hard lines of her face. She was staring at her own hands, still red and raw from the rope. You were good today, he said quietly. On the trail. You were fast. I was angry. She whispered. He nodded. He knew what that felt in her. Tomorrow, he said, his voice low. In that room. It's not just about trying them. It's not about the jail, or the sentence. He waited until she looked at him, her eyes catching the light. It's about clearing your name, for good. It's about taking that red mark he put next to your name and burning it to ash. Tomorrow, you get your name back. Rhea. She looked at him, and for the first time, she believed it. She nodded, a small, tight motion, and leaned her head back against the cold, solid stone of the courthouse. The courtroom in Las Lomas was a different world. It was not a saloon. It was a chamber of stone with high, arched windows, dark mahogany benches, and a 20-foot ceiling. It smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the cold, impartial weight of the law. The room was packed, not with the frightened and angry crowd from Piñon Bluff, but with sober-faced clerks, lawyers in dark suits, and citizens who had come to watch the district attorney. At the front, on a high, carved bench, sat Judge Harlan, a man with a face like a granite cliff and eyes that missed nothing. Vernon Slate sat at the defense table, his new black suit immaculate, his lawyer whispering in his ear. Nolan Pritchard and Jeb Crow sat behind him, looking small and pale. Their town-sized authority completely evaporated in this serious, official place. Rhea, Silas, Ezra, and Alma sat in the front row, directly behind May Delaney. A U.S. Marshal, his badge gleaming, stood by the door. The district versus Pritchard, Crow, and Slate on charges of conspiracy, forgery, and peonage. The bailiff announced. May Delaney rose. She was calm, her voice measured, but it filled the cavernous room. Your Honor, the citizens of this territory are here today because the law was subverted, not by a single act of violence, but by a slow, insidious poisoning of the public trust, a conspiracy to turn desperate, honest people into slaves, using the very tools of our government against them. She began. Her logic as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. She did not start with Rhea. She started with the crime. She placed the heavy iron seal on a table before the judge. Exhibit A, Your Honor. A counterfeit territorial seal, a crude, arrogant forgery, used to stamp false judgments. She placed the red ledger beside it. Exhibit B, the defendant's own ledger, a list of men and women condemned, without trial, to forced labor. A list of human beings, reduced to property, marked for retrieval. She placed the pile of fake vouchers beside that. And Exhibit C, the nuts and bolts of the machine, false debts, fictional bills, the paper chains used to bind these citizens. For an hour, she built her case, her voice never rising, her arguments interlocking like a perfectly constructed wall. Then, Slate's lawyer, Mr. Brophy, rose for his cross-examination. He was slick, his voice dripping with condescension. He did not try to deny the ledgers. He tried to destroy the witnesses. The prosecution's entire case, Brophy announced, rests on the word of vagrants, drifters, and thieves. I call Miss Rhea Calder to the stand. Rhea's heart hammered. This was it. She walked to the witness box, her step steady, and took the oath. Brophy smiled at her, a predator's smile. Miss Calder, Is it true that on the afternoon of October 22nd, you were arrested for stealing a loaf of bread from Mr. Pritchard's bakery? The courtroom murmured. Rhea gripped the wooden rail. Yes, a self-confessed thief. And is it not also true that Mr. Hartwell, your associate, paid Mr. Pritchard a substantial sum to secure your release, a sum far exceeding the value of the bread? He paid for the bread, and he paid for you, did he not? Miss Calder. Brophy interrupted, his voice rising. And ingratitude. You concocted this fantastic story, this tale of fake seals and ledgers. You broke into Mr. Slate's warehouse, did you not? We were looking for proof. You were stealing, Brophy roared. Again, because that is what you are. Is it not a thief? You steal bread. You steal documents. Why should this court believe a single word you say? Rhea faltered. The old shame, the humiliation of that day, washed over her. She looked at Slate, who was smiling. Objection. May Delaney was on her feet, her voice sharp. Counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained. Judge Harlan said, his eyes on Brophy. Watch yourself, counselor. I have no more questions for this witness, Brophy said, dismissing her with a wave. Rhea walked back to her seat, her face burning, her hands shaking. She felt as if she had failed. Silas met her eyes, his expression unchanging. A solid, silent message. It is not over? May Delaney rose for her redirect. Your Honor, Mr. Brophy has opened a door, and I intend to walk through it. He is right. Miss Calder took a loaf of bread. She did so to feed her 7-year-old brother, who was, at that moment, collapsing from starvation. An act of desperation, not greed. She turned to the jury box. But more importantly, he asks why we should believe her. I will tell you why. Because her crime was paid for. Mr. Silas Hartwell paid for that bread with heavy Mexican silver. She then walked back to her table and held up the slim, red ledger. The very ledger the defendants used to mark her for retrieval. They did not forget the debt. They did not care that it was paid. They were angry that Mr. Hartwell's silver had taken a valuable asset out of their hands. They were angry, Your Honor, because a piece of their property had been bought by another. She paused. The defense is correct about one thing. Miss Calder is a thief. She and Mr. Hartwell and Reverend Pike. They stole back the most precious things a person can own, their name and their liberty. They stole this evidence from the men who were using it to steal lives. The room was utterly silent. Rhea was breathing again. Delaney was not finished. I call Alma Reyes to the stand. Alma walked to the stand, her back straight, her scarred face defiant. For the next hour, she told her story. The story of the fake bill, the story of the beating, the story of her husband, taken to a powder gang, never to be seen again. He paid in labor, and he paid in blood. Alma finished, her voice thick but unbroken. And for what a sack of flour we had already paid for with a winter's shearing of wool. Then came 3 others. The gaunt man, his voice trembling as he told of his brother's disappearance. The woman who had lost her son. The same story, over and over. A small, invented debt, a false judgment, a life gone. Finally, May Delaney called her last witness. I call Reverend Ezra Pike. Ezra, in his black preacher's coat, took the stand. Delaney did not question him. She simply said, Reverend, please explain to the court the discrepancies between Exhibit A, the counterfeit seal, and the official standards of the territorial court, which you oversaw for 22 years. For 30 minutes, Ezra lectured. He did not speak of morality. He spoke of craft, of the angle of an eagle's head, the spacing of serifs, the number of stripes on a shield. He spoke of the precise, legal definition of a government press. He was a clerk, a craftsman, and he systematically, with irrefutable, boring, and beautiful logic, destroyed the last shred of the defense. He concluded, This is not just a forgery, Your Honor. This is a technical impossibility. An apprentice with a hammer and a cold chisel could have done better. This was made by men who were not just criminals, but who were arrogant, who believed the people they were crushing would never be seen, and the papers they were using would never be read. He stepped down. The case was over. Judge Harlan looked at Slate's lawyer. Mr. Brophy, do you have a rebuttal? Brophy, his face pale, stood. The defense rests, Your Honor. Judge Harlan leaned forward. His voice was low and cold. This is one of the most repugnant and cowardly conspiracies I have ever seen in my courtroom. It is an insult to this bench, to this territory, and to the United States government. He slammed his gavel. The sound was like a gunshot. This court finds that sufficient evidence has been presented. I am issuing a warrant for the immediate arrest of Nolan Pritchard and Jeb Crow on charges of forgery and conspiracy. They will be held in the Las Lomas jail pending a federal trial. Pritchard let out a small, squeaking sound. Jeb Crow put his head in his hands. Furthermore, the judge continued, this court orders a full and immediate investigation into the business practices of Mr. Vernon Slate and all his associated railroad contracts. You can't, Slate's lawyer jumped up. I can, and I have. Harlan said, 2 U.S. Marshals will seize his offices and all of his ledgers, effective immediately. It was over. Vernon Slate, who had been sitting perfectly still, a smile on his face, finally understood. The judge, the law, his own lawyer, they had all failed him. His world of paper and profit had just collapsed. He stood up, his movement slow, almost casual. This is a mistake, Slate said, his voice no longer a civilized rasp, but a low, animal growl. Sit down, Mr. Slate. The judge ordered. You think this little play ends here, Slate said, looking, not at the judge, but at May Delaney, at Ezra, at Silas, and finally, at Rhea. You, he snarled at her. You caused this. And with a speed that defied his heavy suit. His hand went inside his coat. He was pulling a gun, a small .41 caliber Derringer. The U.S. Marshal was already moving, shouting, but he was too far away. Silas, however, was not. He had been watching Slate's hands, not his face. He had seen the tensing of the shoulder, the shift of the weight. He was a blacksmith. He knew how bodies moved when they were about to strike, before the gun was even clear of the coat. Silas was on him. He didn't use his wounded arm. He didn't throw a punch. He stepped inside the lunge, his good right arm wrapping around Slate's wrist, his powerful, calloused fingers finding the bones, the tendons, the spaces in between. It was a farrier's grip, a grip used to hold the kicking leg of a 1,000-pound horse, a grip that knew how to control power. Slate's face contorted in agony. His fingers, locked in an unbreakable vice, went numb. The Derringer clattered, useless, to the polished wooden floor. Silas did not release him. He used his grip and the man's own forward momentum to twist. He spun Slate around and slammed him, face first, onto the heavy defense table. The crack of bone and wood echoed in the room. Silas held him there, his forearm pressed into the back of Slate's neck, his grip still locked on the man's broken wrist. He was breathing hard, his face pale, but he was in complete control. He looked up, past the man he had just broken, and his eyes found Rhea. The U.S. Marshals swarmed in, pulling Silas back, cuffing Slate, who was screaming, not in rage, but in pure, agonizing pain. The doors of the courtroom were thrown open. The crowd outside, having heard the gavel, the shouts, the thud, was a sea of anxious faces. The marshal emerged, dragging a cursing, disarmed Vernon Slate, followed by a weeping Pritchard and a numbed Jeb Crow, both in chains. The crowd saw, and for a moment there was silence. Then a single voice, a woman, cried out, "They got him!" And the plaza exploded. It was a roar, a sound of pressure released, of a fever breaking. Men threw their hats in the air. Women were crying. From the church on the corner, the big copper bell began to ring. Not the slow toll for evening, but a wild, joyous, chaotic peal, as if the bell ringer himself had gone mad. Rhea stood in the doorway, her hands over her mouth, watching the tide of history wash over the town. Benji, who had been waiting in the hall with Alma, ran to her, grabbing her legs. He looked up at her, his face full of fear and confusion. "Is it over? Rhea, did they win?" Rhea knelt, her hands on his small shoulders. The bells were ringing, a cleansing sound. The town was cheering. She looked at the marshal stuffing Slate into a wagon. A man no longer powerful, just a criminal in a broken suit. She looked at her brother, and for the first time, she smiled. A real smile, one that reached her eyes. "We won, Benji," she whispered, her voice thick. "We have our name back." Benji, who had not understood the trial, or the ledgers, understood that. He understood the smile. He launched himself into her, his arms wrapped around her neck, and a laugh, bright and clear as the ringing bell, burst out of him. Across the sea of shouting people, at the top of the courthouse steps, Silas Hartwell stood, his sling crooked, his good hand resting on the stone railing. He was watching her. He was watching her and the boy. Rhea met his gaze. The crowd, the noise, the bells. It all faded away. There was only his face and the look in his eyes. It was the same look from the night of the rain, the same look from the smoky arroyo. It was not a look of victory. It was a look of promise, a look that said, "We are here, we are whole," a look that promised a future that had, in this one single impossible moment, just been unlocked. The return to Pinyon Bluff was not a triumph. It was a quiet, weary homecoming. The news of Slate's arrest and Pritchard's ruin had arrived before them, carried on the telegraph wire, and the town met them not with cheers, but with a new, sober, and uncertain silence. The judgment that had once coated the street like red dust had been swept clean, leaving the raw boards exposed. Change came, not in a flood, but like the slow, steady melt of spring snow. The first and most visible change was the bakery. Nolan Pritchard's assets were seized by the federal court, his business forfeit, his name a curse. The shop, the source of so much pain, sat dark for 2 months, a hollow tooth in the town's smile. Then, Ezra Pike, using church funds and a quiet, substantial donation from Silas Hartwell, bought the building at auction. It did not reopen as a bakery, not at first. It reopened with a new sign, painted by Rhea. The letters clear and steady. It read, "Bread Light." Alma Reyes, whose husband had been found in a remote work camp and freed by the U.S. Marshals, was given the keys. The new rule, nailed to the door, was simple. A full 10% of all profits would be set aside. This money funded a large pot of hot cornmeal mush, available every morning, free to any child under the age of 10, no questions asked. The bread, Alma said, was to feed the body. The light was to ensure no one ever had to live in the shadows again. The Hartwell Ranch changed as well. The profound quiet of Silver Spur Hollow remained, but the emptiness had vanished. Silas, once his shoulder was fully healed, a long, clean scar, the only reminder, began to build. He did not add on to the main house. That was their sanctuary, the place they had forged their small family. Instead, just past the well house, where the ridge caught the northern wind, but the porch faced the southern sun, he built a new structure. It was long and low, with clean pine walls and a deep, wide veranda. Rhea, watching him set the final porch post, gave it its name, the Wendy Porch House. She called it. It was not a bunkhouse. It was not a hotel. It was a refuge. It was a place for the women who, like Alma, were finding their families again, or, like Rhea, were starting new ones. It was a safe harbor, a place for a woman and her children to stay for a week, or a month, to catch their breath, eat warm food, and stand on a solid floor before facing the world again. Rhea became its keeper. And, in doing so, she became the keeper of their stories. She had bought a new ledger, a thick one bound in clean blue cloth, and as women came and went from the windy porch, she would sit with them, a pot of coffee brewing, and she would listen. She wrote down their names, their children's names, where they came from, what they had lost, and where they were going. It was not a book of debts, but a book of witness. She was meticulously, carefully, giving back the names that the world had tried to erase. Benji, no longer a pale ghost, was thriving. The color had returned to his cheeks, and the light to his eyes. He was sturdy now, his legs strong, his voice loud. He rode the mule to town every morning, not in fear, but with a fierce 9-year-old pride. He was attending the small church school that Ezra Pike had reopened. He was learning his letters, his sums. He was learning to read and write his own name, a name that was now clean, a name he was proud to sign. Silas, too, was a changed man. The walls he had built around himself, the fortress of his grief, had come down, plank by plank. He still spoke little, but his silence was no longer a void. It was an anchor. It was the comfortable, steady quiet of a man at peace in his own home. He began to plant trees along the creek and near the new guest house. He planted a row of young aspen saplings. For shade, in the summer, he'd said, but Rhea knew it was more than that. Planting a tree was an act of faith. It was a promise that he intended to be there to see it grow. He also brought something new to the main porch, from a trader in Las Lomas. He had acquired a set of wind chimes. They were not the small, tinny kind. They were 3 long, heavy rods of thick, blue-green glass. They hung from a piece of weathered driftwood, and it took a strong, honest wind to move them. But when the wind came, they did not jingle. They struck a low, single, resonant chord. A deep, clear note that sang across the hollow. It was not a sound of alarm, but of welcome. A sound that said, "We are here." One afternoon, in the late summer of the following year, the hollow was bathed in a light like wild honey. The high country heat had broken, and the air was sharp and clean. Rhea was sitting on the porch steps, mending a tear in one of Benji's shirts. Silas sat on the chair beside her, slowly oiling a piece of harness, his hands steady and sure. The glass chimes sang their low, clear note. Rhea set her sewing in her lap. "I have something for you," she said, her voice quiet. He paused, his hand halfway through polishing a brass buckle. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, folded square of white linen. It was a man's handkerchief, clean and perfectly pressed. She had spent a month's worth of egg money on the fabric. "This is," she began, feeling a sudden, uncharacteristic shyness. He took it from her. He unfolded it. In the corner, stitched with dark, strong blue thread, was a single letter S. The stitchwork was small, neat, and perfect. He looked at the letter, then at her. "It's to remember," she whispered, her face flushing. "The night you mended my cloak. You were hurt, and you fixed it. I wanted you to have this." Silas's throat felt thick. He ran his calloused blacksmith's thumb over the raised, smooth threads. It was the finest stitching he had ever seen. He nodded, unable to find the words. He carefully, deliberately, folded the handkerchief and placed it in the breast pocket of his own shirt, letting the corner with the S sit just over his heart. "I have something too," he said, his voice rough. He set the harness aside. He reached deep into the small watch pocket of his denim trousers, his big fingers fumbling for a moment. He pulled out a ring. It was not a new, bright, fashionable thing from a city jeweler. It was old, the silver worn smooth, tarnished in the deep grooves of the carving. It was a simple, heavy band, and on its flat face was the image of a single pinyon pine, its roots spreading wide and deep. "This was my mother's," Silas said, his gaze on the ring. Not on her. She was born in these mountains. She always said the pinyon was the most honest tree. It gives shade, and it gives food, and it gives fire, and all it asks for in return is a piece of rock to hold on to. He held it out to her, not in his palm, but between his thumb and forefinger. It was not a question. It was an offering, a statement of fact. Rhea looked at the ring, at the deep roots carved in the silver. She looked at his face, at the lines of honesty and pain and strength that life had carved there. She put down her sewing. She wiped her hand, suddenly damp, on her apron. She held out her left hand. It was no longer the hand of a starving drifter. It was the strong, capable, chapped hand of a woman who ran a ranch, who built fires, who held a pen. He took her hand. He slid the old silver ring onto her third finger. It fit, as if it had been made for her. They stood up then, on the porch, under the high, clear sky. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the red rock walls of the canyon in fire. They did not speak the grand, easy words of love and forever. This land did not trade in such things. He took both her hands in his. His were large, rough, warm. Hers were small, strong, and anchored by the cool weight of the silver. "Rhea," he said, his voice low. "The one he used only for her. The storms will come back. This is hard country. There will be wind, and there will be bad winters." "I know," she whispered, her eyes never leaving his. "I can't promise to stop the wind," he said, his grip tightening on her hands. "I can't promise to make the rain fall. I can only promise this: I will stand with you, will stand. I will not turn away. When the wind blows, I will be the wall at your back. And I," she said, her voice thick, her eyes bright, "will be the fire that warms the stone. I am not leaving. Silas." That was their vow, an exchange of truth. He leaned in, and he kissed her. It was not the desperate, healing kiss of that first rainy night. This was the kiss of two people who had chosen. It was slow and sure and certain. It was the kiss of a husband and a wife, a kiss that tasted of pine and wood smoke, and a shared, quiet, unbreakable future. His rough hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone, and she leaned into his strength, her own hands, with the ring, resting on the solid wall of his chest. A high-pitched, joyous shout shattered the perfect quiet. "I got me, Rhea, Silas, I got me, look." The moment did not break, it simply opened. They turned, their arms still around each other, as Benji came tearing up from the creek. He was soaked, covered in mud, and his face was split by a grin of pure, triumphant joy. He was holding up a string, and on it, 3 small, silver-sided trout wriggled in the dying light. "I caught them!" he yelled, skidding to a halt on the porch. "All by myself for supper." He didn't wait for congratulations. He launched himself at them, a small, wet, ecstatic missile. He wrapped his arms around both of them, his muddy face buried against Rhea's skirt, his other arm clamping around Silas's leg. Laughter, sudden and warm, broke from Rhea. Silas's good arm, the one that had been mended, and Rhea's arm, the one that wore the ring, both wrapped around the boy, pulling him into the center of their embrace. The 3 of them stood there, a single, solid shape, bathed in the golden light. In the West, some stories are written in gunpowder and blood, but some stories, the ones that last, do not begin with a lightning strike. They begin in the dust, with the simple, quiet chime of silver coins and a hand, held out at the right moment. They are not stories of easy passion, but of hard-won purpose. And from that purpose, justice can grow. It grows slowly, quietly, like the piñon, finding its hold in the deep cracks of the red rock, its roots spreading, unseen, until they are strong enough to break the stone. Thank you so much for listening to our story, and we would love to hear where in the world you are listening from. So please share your thoughts and your location in the comments. Subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and please support us by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by many more.